I'm going to talk about the evolution of songs in hummingbird species through social vocal learning. Um, Behavior is unique in the sense that it can be acquired through social learning, and social learning is the ability to modify your behavior based on social experience, based on looking at what other individuals are doing. And we know this is widespread in animals. Maybe the most studied examples of this is vocal learning in birds, but we also know the use of tools is acquired through social learning in many species. There are also very interesting examples in other birds like red tits, in which individuals look at how other individuals forage and then they acquire the same foraging strategies, and that different social groups, different subpopulations reach different solutions from the same foraging problems. And we know that for our species it's also like a very important trait that has allowed to produce the cultural richness that is characteristic for our different populations. And this is also an important emergent property of social learning when that's accumulated through generations. When traits are learned from our individuals, that usually create some divergence in the traits that are expressed or used in different populations, and that creates these cultural pools that are also changing through times through the cultural evolution process. And this process, actually Darwin was the first to notice that there is some interesting similarities between the ways that culture, well, he talked about languages, and the way that species evolve. And actually linguists are using now phylogenetic trees and phylogenetic comparative methods to study, well, to represent and study how the languages evolve, in the same way that we do it with species. But besides these similarities, there are important differences between the two ways of transmitting information across generations. So in one hand, like genetic inheritance it can only happen through vertical transmissions, which is going from offspring from parents to offspring. And then mutations can occur to produce more diversity, but then they need also, they depend on these parents to offspring or vertical transmission to be transmitted to other generations and to be spread out in the population. But when we look at cultural inheritance, it seems way more flexible. You can have oblique transmission, which is when you have individuals learning from unrelated individuals from different generations, or even horizontal transmission, learning from individuals, unrelated individuals from the same generation. And this allows that when you have new variants, like cultural mutations or innovations, they can transmit or spread in the population much faster than in genetic inheritance, which makes the cultural evolution process also more dynamic, and which could also have implications at the macroevolution level if this is promoting continuous change and rapid diversification of traits that are acquired through social learning, which in cases like the bird song that are signals that are needed for mating, they could potentially create reproductive barriers between populations, and that could result also in rapid speciation events. And it has been suggested at least for as one of the reasons why some birds are so diverse. But we still know very little on whether this has played a role in the evolution of this group. Well, and as you know, this group, the birds, it has been an important system to understand vocal learning and cultural evolution in animals, in non-human animals. And there are three groups in which this has evolved, this vocal learning ability. Vocal learning is rare in animals in general and also in birds. In birds, we have it in three groups, hummingbirds, parrots, and songbirds. Still, we are not sure whether parrots and songbirds acquired that from the same common ancestor or that evolved independently, but that happened independently for sure in hummingbirds. So we definitely need to understand not on what is going on vocal learning in hummingbirds to have a more comprehensive idea of this ability and their potential evolutionary consequences of vocal learning and cultural evolution. But most of the research that has been done on this field, it has been done on songbirds. As you can see here, this is number of papers when I do a query on vocal learning on songbirds or parrots or hummingbirds, and is overwhelmingly biased to research on songbirds. So we know very little about these other groups, which means that what we know about avian vocal learning is mostly about songbirds vocal learning. So I studied the behavior and vocal behavior of long-billed hermits. So these are hummingbirds found in the tropics, mostly on rainforest, lowland rainforest. They're very interesting for this type of questions. First, because they have these legs in which males get together in an area in the forest to sing and display, mostly singing, and they do it for a long time during the year, for some breeding seasons of up to 8 months, and they have some 5 to 8 hours of daily singing, which is very convenient to study the vocal behavior. And on top of that, the songs are learned, and these songs are the primary mating signal. So it seems to be critical trait to for the reproductive behavior of this species. And the song is relatively simple. It's something that they do most of the time when they are at the lake, and this is a spectrogram with time, x-axis, and frequency in the y-axis. And this is just basically showing us that the song is a repetition of the same unit over and over again, and they do this for long periods of time. As I mentioned, they do it at their perches in the lake. So the territories in the lake are a set of perches that they switch from one to the other during the day. But then you have several of these territories at the lake. So the lakes are composed of several males in which they have their well-defined territories from which they sing and try to attract mates. But there are important levels of vocal variation within and between legs, and this is what I'm gonna try to explain with this diagram. So let's say this is a leg with 6 individuals, and the type of vocal variation that you see at the leg level is one of singing neighborhoods. So the different colors are representing individuals singing the song types that match the color that are at the bottom of the slide. So basically this is showing that we have subgroups of individuals that are singing a different song type within the lake. So this is a small area, it's like 100 by 150 meters, and when you have this crazy microgeographic scale vocal variation. And more that when you look at other lakes, this variation also happens between lakes. So you don't have song types that are shared between different lakes. So song types are just sung by a few individuals in a lake, and those are not present in any other lake. So we have this highly diverse cultural system that is also seems to be pretty dynamic through time, that I'm going to show in the next slide. But this is just an example of the some real data, the actual lakes that I was studying. So this is in Costa Rica, Central America, and I was working mostly at La Selva, which is this the map in the lower left corner. And in that map, you can see 4 of the lakes that I studied there. And the dotted lines takes you to the spectrograms of the songs that were present at each of those lakes. For instance, SJA have these 2 song types that are clearly different. LOC and CCL both have only 1 song type. And Sur have these 2 song types, and for that lake, Sur, or SUR, I'm showing also the actual map of the territories and how the different song types were shared across the different individuals. So each polygon in that submap there is the territory of one of the individuals, and the color indicates which of the song types is sung by each of the territorial individuals of that lake. And I also work at 2 other sites. When you go back to the map of Costa Rica, you see TR2. This is Tirimbín, another reserve close to La Selva. That lake that I studied there had 2 song types, and the same thing happened at Toiserere, the point at the right side of the Costa Rica map that is labeled as HC1 and has another 2 song types that are also pretty different. So this is the actual variation that we see at the leg level that is not, and again, sometimes are not shared between different legs, and also at the population level you see the same pattern. They are not shared across different populations. So I was lucky enough to have to come across these recordings that were made in the 1960s and 70s and 80s by these 2 researchers, Gary Stiles and Larry Wolf. They did a lot of work on this species that used to be named as long-tail hermit, but it's the same species that I studied. And they actually work at the same, well, I work at the same lakes that they worked at La Selva some 40, 50 years ago. And I got the recordings that they made at these sites, and I was able to compare the songs from that time to the ones that I recorded more recently. And this is just an example of how for this lake that I'm marking here at the map that I also visited, this is a map that they created, and I also visited that lake more recently. And you can see that the songs that were present there in the 70s, they're completely gone now. So none of those song types survived to the present day, which suggested that there is some cultural evolution going on, and it seems to be pretty fast, pretty dynamic. That's what I wanted to study more in depth. So for understanding this cultural evolution process of the songs, first I needed to quantify the song structure, and I did that through using machine learning algorithms. I'm not going to explain that in more detail. But based on that quantification, I was able then to describe the process of cultural evolution and how the structure changed through time and space. And finally, I wanted to understand whether this diversification of the songs through cultural evolution has some impact in the overall acoustic space of the species. And basically, I wanted to know if this cultural evolution produces endless variation that is unbounded, or if there are some limits to this diversification. So this is a first look at the data that we were able to put together. So the x-axis is showing the 14 legs at which we recorded songs. The number of recordings per leg is also shown at the y-axis. So we have some 5 to 6 legs in which we have a decent sample size to look at this. But in total, we have a pretty big data set with more than 1,600 recordings, and in which we selected more than 11,000 songs. So it's a pretty massive data set. And this is the similar graph, but also showing the proportions of sounds or recordings that were made in different years. So in red, you can see like the earliest years in which Gary and Larry were recording there. And in blue is the more recent years in which when I was recording down there too. So for some 4, 5 legs, we have a representation in those 2 periods, and mostly from the first leg, but also our legs we can have a comparison across these 2 periods for a range of between 40 and 48 years. The song was quantified using a machine learning algorithm, as I said. Usually try one of these 3, or people try one of these 3 different methods to characterize or quantify the structure of sounds or vocal signals. Cross-correlation, which is looking at the similarity of the spectrograms of different sounds or signals. Dynamic time warping is using the frequency contours as time series and applying methods to compare up to quantify the similarity of this time series. And probably the most common way to quantify sound structure is measuring a bunch of spectral parameters like duration, fundamental frequency, peak frequency, amplitude, entropy, and so on. So people usually pick up one of those 3 methods, but I thought like they all represent the important characteristics of the sound that can be useful to get a more realistic representation of the structure, the acoustic structure of the sounds. So I basically did all this analysis and I put them together into a random forest classification method, which is very powerful at dealing with lots of data and focusing on the data that is more useful for separating the categories that we give a priori to the method. So it's a supervised method, and at the end it gives you some measurement of how accurate was the classification. It also gives you some measurement of similarity. It's called a proximity matrix, which basically gives you for each of the classes that you use in the to train the method, it gives you a measurement of distance. So how it's kind of how similar were the different classes. In this case, the different sound types, how similar they are, which can be thought as an acoustic space and can actually be converted to acoustic space, in which then we can evaluate our hypothesis on cultural divergence, or you'll be used in our type of statistical analysis. So basically I used random forest to verify that the method was doing a good job at representing the variation that we observe in the songs, and also to as a dimension reduction method to be able to have a smaller set of parameters representing the acoustic space of the species. And this method seemed to be pretty good at classifying the sounds of this species. So this is the classification accuracy for the four methods, well, the three methods that I mentioned, and my method that was using all those three methods together, so that's the one in red. And as you can see, that has a higher classification accuracy. The x-axis here is just the number of parameters per tree. Random forest creates many decision trees, and this is the only tuning parameter that this method has. But it's not really important for the point that I want you to get here. That is that using all these three methods is way better than using one of the methods independently. And the classification was pretty accurate. It was 96% of accurately classified songs on test data, so on data that was not used to produce the predictive model. And so about the cultural evolution and some descriptive data on the sound types and how they change through time. So we observe, this is the histogram of the distribution of the frequencies of lifespans for the sound types. So most of them live around 1 year, but in average, the sound types survive 3.5 years, and just a few make it longer than 5 years, and more than 10 years is like very rare. So they have a short lifespan, although it seems to be at least to live longer than the birds that seems to have a lifespan or longevity of some 2.5 years, 3 years tops. But even more interesting, we observed that at the leg level, the songs or the sound types are more similar to each other compared to legs from other, to songs from other legs. So there is some leg level signature, which is what this plot is showing here. So we have the acoustic similarity in the y-axis, and we have the pairwise comparisons of sound types from the same leg at the left side and from different legs at the right side. So, and this difference was significant when we used a mantle test to test it. But this also has some implications to understand how the variation, the cultural mutations are produced in this species, because it means that the new songs are still similar to the songs that were previously found at the leg, which also suggests that the birds are using some of those original sound types and modifying those sound types to create these new mutated or innovations that are fitting this cultural evolution process. And we look at this similarity, how it changes through time. We see that the acoustic similarity decreases when the time passes. So we have acoustic similarity to the first year of a leg, the first year that we got data for the leg, and that's in the y-axis, the similarity, and then we compare year 1 against year 2, year 1 against 3, and so on. So basically this is telling us that this leg acoustic signature is how actually gets lost through time. So it seems to survive for some 6-7 years, but then after those 7 years, the song structure is not very similar to the original songs or the songs that were present there some 7 years later. At the end of the curve, like close to 50 years of data, we see some increase with the similarity to the songs that were present there like 50 years earlier, but we're not sure whether this is like a real pattern, that there is some convergence after this specific time window, or this could be also an artifact of a smaller sample size that we have for those last years. but this is definitely something that we'll want to investigate further. So this is the acoustic space that we got from the random forest analysis, and this is showing, so the colors are the different legs, and each point is a song type. As you can see, there is no clear pattern of clustering of song types from the same leg, but we are including song types from many different years, so we already know that this similarity get like the leg acoustic signature gets lost through time. So it makes sense that there is no pattern here, and this graph doesn't tell us much about the process, the cultural evolution process in this system. And it's more informative if we look at each of the legs and how the song moved through the acoustic space through time. So this is one of the legs that we don't have much data, but it's just to explain how these graphs work. So this is a phylogram representing the historical process of cultural evolution in this leg BR2, and at the tips we have the labels and spectrograms of each of the song types, and the time when they appear at the leg. And the scatter plot at the right side of the slide is showing the total acoustic space of the species or the populations that we studied, and in colors we have the acoustic space that is covered by the song types for this leg. And these points are also linked by these branches that are colored, and these colors represent the time from the root, so the time from the first year in which we got data for those legs. So it's basically representing when it's going from blue to red, that is representing how the acoustic space of the leg move across this overall acoustic space of the species. So for this leg, it doesn't tell us much, it's not enough data, but when we start looking at other legs with more data, we see that legs seem to move quite a good amount across the acoustic space of the species. This leg also, we don't have much data. We started recording in 2011. We see other legs. This one that was recorded in the 70s and has been recording recently too. We see that it kind of spreads out across most of the acoustic space of the species. So it started kind of the center of a low bottom right side of the acoustic space, and then it started moving towards the other side, pretty much like the other corner of the acoustic space. In some cases, going back to areas of the acoustic space that were already produced earlier at those legs. That's another example. I like that, which we have the most detailed catalog or representation of the songs of the leg, and you can see a similar pattern in which the song structure of the leg diverge quite a good amount and cover pretty new areas of the acoustic space that were not present there during the first year. And it's also important to see that it's covering these new areas, but it's also kind of reaching the end points of the acoustic space of the species, which somehow suggests that this evolutionary process is not limitless, is not endless, but there are some boundaries to the type of acoustic signals, to the songs that they can produce. Although this is not a definitive answer to that, but it's at least a nice way to explore these ideas. This the last example I have for that in this a very similar pattern, which the songs move to different areas of the acoustic space of the species. Although there's some cases like in the CCK song type in which they come back to structures that were present at the lake some 50 years, 40 years earlier. And trying to figure out this idea of how the acoustic space is covered through time, and whether like that happens, the divergence is bounded or not. So I look at the accumulation of the acoustic space with increasing effort, increasing number of sound types, and this is analogous to the species accumulation curve that people use to figure out if the communities have been sampled in a representative manner. And this is showing here that, in fact, that the accumulation of the acoustic space reaches some flat after some 50, 60 sound types have been sampled. And this was done with some bootstrapping or selecting randomly songs from different sound types. So this also kind of suggests that this diversification is also bounded. Although still, I'm not sure if this would be a definitely answer, a definitive answer for this hypothesis. But in summary, we think that the cultural evolution process in this system is pretty dynamic and is very impressive, and comparable to other systems, mostly on songbirds, and actually more dynamic than many of those cultural evolution processes in songbirds and also in parrots. Our data seems to suggest that the divergence is not limitless, but that there is some boundaries to the possible structures of the songs that are produced, that are generated through this cultural evolution process. But we still need to dig more on the data, on different ways to test this, probably using some phylogenetic comparative methods like Ornstein-Uhlenbeck models that represent bounded diversification. You can compare that to Brownian motion models in which divergence is unbounded. And I hope that this also convinces you about the validity or the usefulness of looking at hummingbirds when we want to study vocal learning and to understand it in a more comprehensive way. And now we're working on some agent-based simulations, basically creating virtual legs in which individuals die and new individuals come and learn sounds from the territorial males that were present at the leg, and then using different rules as learning through conformity, copying the most common, or anti-conformity, the least common, or some other rules that are common in cultural evolution research, and then comparing those simulations to the actual data to try to get, to find the models or the learning rules that produce the best fit to the real system. And another analysis that I think is would be very informative is deconstructing the sounds in kind of sound subunits or segments. For instance, like this sound that we have here, we could say that there is a pure tone at the beginning and there is a trill that for the species like a broad band trill, and then there is some frequent modulation at the end. So decomposing all the sounds on those basic sounds, and then trying to produce all possible combinations of those different sounds and look at whether the species is able to produce all those types of combinations, or if there are some combinations that are not present. Somehow producing a new acoustic space, but based on the sequences of different sounds, and looking at whether all the acoustic, the possible acoustic space is represented or not by the sound that we observe in this species.